Okay, this is the second video describing state machines. Remember last time we talked about state machines and there were three things to understand. The output of the machine, the input to the machine, and the states of the machine. And so what we found is we built a little state machine that basically turned a light on and off. Okay, let's go through and take another kind of state machine. And this is going to be a non-trivial state machine. And this is going to be a light I've switched turning on and off a lamp, but it's going to turn it off in a little bit differently, and that's what makes it non-trivial. So what says here at the last paragraph, okay, we have a light that turns on and off, and what we're going to do is we transition from the light being bright to the light being dark to the light being dark to bright, dark, light to dark, etc. Okay, by every time we push the switch down. So we push the switch down, so it goes from an unpressed to a press, and that will change the the state of the light. So the light will go, if it's dark, it'll go light. If it goes, it'll go bright. If it's bright, it'll go dark. Okay. When we let up the switch, nothing happens, but when we press the switch again, then it will also toggle the light. So it'll go from dark to bright or bright to dark. Okay, so that's the kind of machine we're trying to build. This is going to require a state machine. Okay, so this is basically what it would look like in our timeline. Okay, as we did before, the timeline basically shows the time along this horizontal axis. We have the places where we update the state machine. Okay, these are the only places that state machine looks at this switch. Okay, and we want a situation where we're unpressed. Okay, starting and we're in the dark out. This is the output, not the state, by the way, here. We want to press, when we press down the switch, we want to go from dark to light. Okay? Now notice when we let the switch at the time that we do the state transition. When we let the switch up, okay, nothing happens, right? So now we go from pressed to unpressed because it's not supposed to change when we go from pressed to unpressed. Then we go over here and then we press again and then we go the next, so the next transition, when we, excuse me, when we looked at the switch here, it was unpressed. We had our finger off the switch. When we looked at the state machine, looked at the switch at this state transition point, we would have, we were pressed, so it wants to take the output and go from bright to dark. So this describes the behavior of the machine we want to put together. Okay? Now, easiest way is for me to do it for you. And so this is an example. Notice before we only had two states, okay? And so they were on and off. Okay, we have more states, and I decided not to name them because after you get too many states, you just quit coming up with good names for them. So this is state 0, state 1, state 2, state 3. So there's three states in the state machine. Okay, there are two outputs. It's dark or bright, bright, dark. So it's just dark or bright or this output. And each of these states will go through and determine whether the light is dark or bright. And then there's the input, which is unpressed. The switch is unpressed or the switch is pressed. So this is exactly the situation we had before. It's just going to give us a different behavior in the way that the light turns on and off. So let's go through this, and I want to go through it step by step. Okay, so let's assume that we start in state 0. And by the way, you could start in any state, but you got to start somewhere. So state 0. So if we're in state 0, the light is going to be dark. Okay, and if we are unpressed, we stay in state 0. So that's kind of like at the beginning of what we would do. So the light's going to stay dark as long as we unpress. Okay. Now, as soon as the state machine looks at the switch and finds that it went from unpressed to pressed, the state machine will move us into state 1. Okay. So this completely describes the behavior of state 0. So state 0, it stays dark as long as you do not press the switch. As soon as you press the switch, you go to another state. Okay, so let's go to state 1, which is the next state. State 1, okay, we stay in state 1 as long as you continue to hold the switch down, okay? So, and while we're in state 1, the light will be bright, okay? So we're stuck in state 1. How do we get out of state 1? We get out of state 1 when we unpress the switch. So we take our finger off the switch, okay? And so now we're heading to state 2. Let's look at how state 2 behaves. State 2 behaves that we stay in state 2 as long as we have our finger off the switch, okay? So the switch is unpressed, and but we didn't change the light, right? So the light is still bright because the only time the light changes is when we go from unpressed to pressed. And in this case, we went from pressed to unpressed, so the light remains bright. Okay, and how do we stay in what? How long do we stay in state 2? Until we press the switch. So we go from unpressed to press. So let's look at state 3. State 3 is shown here. Because we went from unpressed, our finger off the switch, to pressed, our finger is pushing down on the switch, we now go in, we turn the light from bright to dark. Previously, we turned it from dark to bright. This time we go from bright to dark. How long do we stay in this state? As long as we continue to hold our finger on the switch. Okay. How do we get out of this this state, excuse me? We just go unpressed. We take our finger off the switch. Does that change the light? Because it's dark here, it's still supposed to stay dark because we only change the light when it goes from unpressed to press. So now we end up back here into dark. So we return here, okay? So what does this do? This causes it to go from dark to bright and bright to dark every time we press the switch. We come back here and we go dark to bright, bright to dark. We just keep on doing this as we go around this thing. Okay? Now, convince yourself that this completely describes a state machine, what we want the light and the switch to do. How the light behaves when we press the switch. If I were the user of this device where I would exactly know how this thing is going to work. If I'm the hardware designer, I exactly know how to design this and build it. And if I'm the software programmer, I know exactly how to program this. So this is an unambiguous description of this little machine that we've worked on. Now, this is kind of cool because you can draw these things any way you want. Notice what happens is in the previous machine, it went from left to right, and then it went back over to the left side as it moved through the states. You can also go through and do this thing as a circle. Okay, and a circle depiction is really good for a periodic state machine. It's going around in a circle. And guess what? That's kind of what these machines do. Most of the machines go around in a circle of some sort. So convince yourself that what I've shown here is the same state machine with exactly the same behavior as the system that I showed you in the previous slide, the linear one. Okay, now generally we want the state machine to start somewhere when we turn the power on. So if this is battery operated, when we can connect the battery. If this is on a robot, it's when the robot controller first starts up. We want this to be in some kind of a state. I just arbitrarily assume that in our depiction that we want the light to be turned off or the light will be dark, okay, when we first start our machine. And so this would show that we'd start our machine in state 0. Okay, so we start a machine in state 0, and we do that by showing this little arrow with a dark circle at the end of it. This says this is called the initial state or the initial condition for this particular machine. Now you say, well, hold it, if we want it to start dark, we could have also started it here. But that would be kind of weird because it was already, if the switch is unpressed, it would immediately go here. and it would be a little bit meaningless to start it here. So start it in a meaningful place. And generally, you start all the machine designs from its initial position, its initial condition, the initial state. And generally, the initial state is 0. So don't run the states backwards, for example. Okay. So that finishes this discussion, okay, of our little light switch. We're going to look at something now that's going to be a simple arm, but I'd like you to think about what you learned from the light switch and do your quality assessment to make sure that you learned the things that you wanted to, and you can pick up the next video in the next lesson.